Good morning, Nick Vickers here, calling from Sydney in Australia. I'm coming to you from the Wongal lands of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present and acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first custodians of our lands, our waters and our skies. I would also like to advise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers that this recording contains images of Aboriginal people who have died. Before I talk about Greg Waite, I would like to acknowledge with great thanks Alan Keane and the artists well who have invited me to share some Australian stories with you. This morning we've been invited to the studio, the gallery and the house, all in one, of Greg Waite. Greg is an Australian photographer who has been very forefront in the Australian photographic scene since the 1960s. There was an amazing time in the 1960s where there was a group of artists who came together in a project called the Yellow House. And this was an opportunity for artists to get together and share ideas. At that time, Greg was very much a part of that, but he was also the leading Australian artist, Martin Sharp's assistant, which gave him a really interesting insight into the art world in Sydney and in Australia. He also worked with a well-known British photographer called Alan Nye, who started off, I think that he originally came to Australia to film the Royal Tour, and he loved it so much that he stayed here. So Greg became his assistant after Martin Sharp went on to see his career in the UK. During that time and after that time, all of the artists that Greg knew and documented their work, he photographed and he's collated them into a book of Australian artists. And it's a tremendous book of photographs of some of the leading artists in Australia. During that time, he was also starting to take an interest in the Central Desert and the Northern Territory of Australia. This is a wild and barren kind of area which is full of incredibly rich and beautiful landscapes, scenery, waterfalls, all sorts of amazing places. So whilst he was there, he took many photographs which we're going to show you, but also he captured the lives and times of some of Australia's leading Indigenous artists. Stay with this program because at the very end there is a really moving image which I'm looking forward to sharing with you. So thank you. Hello, Greg. How are you?
I'm doing very well. All the better for seeing you.
Thank you for inviting me in.
Welcome.
This is a great space.
This is the best little gallery in Sydney.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
And whose are these works?
They're my works.
All of them?
All these on this side are my works.
Okay.
And on the other side we have some of Carol's works.
Okay.
This is just a stock room fill-in show in the interim.
Wow, it's a wonderful space.
Yeah. Been going for 25 years now.
Really?
Little gallery is, yeah.
Oh my goodness. I've admired your work for so long, and I wanted to actually find out, when you went to art school, did you go to East Sydney Technical College, or where did you get your training?
Well, that's always been the sort of Achilles heel of my life, because both my eldest siblings went to the National Art School, and by the time I came along, 6 years after they were art students, my parents said no more artists in the family. And so I had to get a practical career happening, and the most practical career that I could manage at the time was working in the art department of an advertising agency. So I felt that I was, edging into the art department, but I had a commercial backbone. My father said, artists don't make money, and you have to be sensible about this. And I worked in an advertising agency for several years, more or less the dog's body of the agency, which meant that I got to know Sydney quite well, delivering things to various places, including photographic studios. And also not far from where I worked in York Street, just down the road in Sussex Street, was a well-known pub called the Royal George Hotel, and it was frequented by artists, intellectual thinkers, the well-known Sydney Push used to go to the Royal George Hotel. And as soon as I found out that that was within walking distance of where I worked, I made it my duty to go down there every Friday afternoon with my pay in my pocket and my hopes in my heart, and listen to the conversations and see what was to be said and who was saying it. And one of the members of the Sydney Push was a gentleman called Charlie Brown, and he was always at the centre of a conversation. He was very, he was a bit of a raconteur, which was a word that I had to work out the meaning of later in life, not too much later, and found out that it was that it meant somebody who captivated people's attention, knew a lot about everything, and was able to just talk about usually anything that was to do with art Charlie knew about. And one evening down at the Royal George Hotel, I said to him at the age of about 18 that I didn't feel really connected with the advertising world, but I felt a closer assimilation with the art world and artists in general. And he leant across the bar and sort of said, this was in the mid-60s, he said, you might be just the right person to work for Martin Sharp. And Martin had been one of the three founders of the Sydney magazine called Oz magazine, which was a very controversial, boundary-pushing, social, changing, society-changing, sort of challenging, magazine. And the Oz magazine had been closed according to, at the time it had been closed due to a obscenity charge. They'd done something quite mild of having a photograph on the cover of the magazine of 2 men or 3 men standing next to this water fountain which was set into the wall of the P&O building. That was a sculpture made by Tom Bass, quite a well-known sculpture. It was just inset into the wall, and because these men appeared to be urinating into the building, into the sculpture on the side of the P&O, it was quite kind of a little twist of. So Charlie discreetly slipped Martin's phone number across the bar and gave it to me and said, "I'll talk to him about this, give him a ring." So I subsequently rang Martin the following evening and arranged to meet him over at his place. I went into the back door following his instructions, and his mother answered the back door and said, "Oh, you must be Greg." She was a charming, lovely, kind of, middle-aged woman with blue eyes like Martin, red lipstick. She invited me in and said, "His Lordship has not emerged yet, but trust me, when he smells the coffee, he'll be down." And she went and told him that I was here, and that he came down, and we sat down together, the 3 of us, at the kitchen table in their expansive property right on top of the hill, at Bellevue Hill, overlooking Sydney Harbour, where you could see towards the Opera House and the Harbour Bridge, and we had coffee, and Martin flipped through the newspaper and noticing various articles that he could then twist into satirical cartoons for the newspapers, because he'd now finished with the Oz magazine, and he was now working with as a satirist, a political satirist in particular, for the Sydney Morning Herald. And anyway, we chatted. We got on very well. I felt he was. I felt a strong familiarity with him. And at the end of this morning interview, which lasted about an hour, it turned out that I had the job as his studio assistant, which was something that Charlie assured me he needed. So I turned up the following day, and we started work, and he was always very busy at it, creating new artworks, and this was an exhibition that was called Art for Art's Sake, and it was to open at the Clune Galleries in Macleay Street.
That was a very kind of avant-garde space, wasn't it?
Yeah. Run by Thelma Clune, I think, and being the celebrity of the Sydney art scene, he basically had arranged this opening to be there, and I was busy in his studio, being given the paintbrush to sort of finish things off or apply more paper mache to a sculpture that he was working on. He openly admitted that he was going to make the mess and I was going to clean it up, and as time went by, this was the way it worked, and people would come and go, and I met Barry Humphries over lunch one day there with Joan, Martin's mother, had prepared a lunch, and I was sort of just like rubbing shoulders with Fame the whole time there, and as a teenager doing my best to sort of get my head around the sort of avant-garde art world, really. it was an initiation really into the art world, because of the people I met and because of the energy that creative environment had was involved with, and so following that, Martin headed off to Europe, basically to sort of further his celebrity status, and he did. He worked for Big O Posters in London, and he did posters of Jimi Hendrix and the Cream. He did record covers for the Cream. He met Eric Clapton. Went to parties at, like, Salvador Dali's in Spain, and was mixing with the who of the international art world in a sense.
I was going to ask you, when Martin left, what happened to your career?
Yeah, I made the decision that wherever I was heading, it was going to be connected with art. I felt that artists and myself were all kindred spirits, and then after that got a job at an Indian restaurant. And while at the Indian restaurant, I'm just filling in time, because basically you have to keep your finger on the pulse when you don't quite know where you're going, but you know virtually when the moment arrives, you'll have to seize that opportunity. And there are opportunities that, everywhere. It's just a matter of knowing whether they're going to be suitable for you or not. And one night in this Indian restaurant, a long-haired English man with a Cockney accent was hosting 3 rather beautiful women to a dinner, and at the end of the evening he slapped a bundle of notes on the table and gave me his business card and said, "If you're interested in photography, give me a call tomorrow, and if you don't ring, I'll hire somebody else." And one of the models, they were models at the table, said, he's one of the best in the business. And he said, "No, darling, I am the best in the business."
Who are we talking about?
We're talking about a man whose name was Alan Nye, and Nye. And he had come out to Australia in the early 60s, and this is now 1965. And he'd come to Australia to cover the royal visit by Queen Elizabeth in the early 60s, and he was working for a English publication, and he fell in love with Australia and decided that this was the land of milk and honey, and he'd been well educated in terms of photography and was right up there with all the technical know-how to really nail it. So he opened a studio in Surrey Hills called Studio 49, and it was an old terrace house with, a front room as a studio, and then there's sort of dining room, and then a dark room out in the backyard. And, so I followed up that invitation and became his studio assistant. So I'd gone out of Martin's place
as an assistant, took over a job as a photographic assistant, and basically had to face the harsh taskmaster of the dark room at the end of every shoot. Wow.
So within 6 months I was producing high quality black and white prints for newspaper reproduction and going on location shoots with Alan. He drove around in a Rolls Royce. He made a lot of money. I was given the keys to his Rolls Royce. I was enjoying the glamour and being involved in a business where beautiful models were wandering around topless most of the time and slithering in and out of the car like gorgeous snakes wearing different garments and getting ready for the next shoot. And I had to behave as an assistant, make sure the right film was in the camera, make sure that the film was processed properly at the end of the day, and spent 2 years working with him. He had a notorious reputation, and he explained to me, he said one day when I got there, and he opened the door looking very hungover, he said, and he clapped his forehead and said, "I just must have insulted everybody last night." He said, "But that's what I do. You'll get used to it." And I did get used to it, and he used to insult models and insult waiters that weren't very prompt in their service. And after 2 years, I learned a lot about photography.
I bet.
And then a lot about the quality, the pace, the necessity to keep the standard high. Mm-hmm. And within about, when I left that job, I ended up opening my own studio.
What a wonderful training.
It was incredible. It was
This is very much a case of, when a door opens, you've either got to decide whether you're going to walk through it or not. And I think that is what you're alluding to in the visual arts, in the creative industry. Doors open, and sometimes we walk past them, other times we walk through them. And whatever happens after that is in the lap of the gods.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. I think it relates to what I said earlier about opportunities and whether you recognise a certain opportunity as being favourable. And when he handed me his business card, I saw it as an opportunity, and I thought, even though he was a very flawed person, with a huge chip on his shoulder, he insisted on me producing the best that could be done in terms of quality of print, in terms of towing the line, in terms of making sure that everything technically was done properly, and he was a harsh taskmaster. I was young enough to endure that, the high society of Sydney, and recognised. And in those days, in Melbourne, Helmut Newton and Henry Talbot were the leading fashion photographers. In Laurie Legay in Sydney, Alan was up there in terms of originality and creativity with those people, but he had this burden to carry of being an unwanted child to one of the most wealthy families in the world, and there was a chip on his shoulder, and it gave him license to treat people badly, and he did it. But and I received the brunt of his anger from time to time, but I also learned a huge amount. And
so, do you think it was that drew you to producing that amazing book of portraits of artists? Was that as a result of the training that you received from him? Did it give you the confidence to approach those artists and tell them about the project. Actually, we should have a look at your book if you've got it handy.
There's the book.
That's the book. And when did this one come out?
This was published in 2004. In answer to that earlier question, in 1965 I worked for Alan Nye, and I also worked for Martin Sharp. And when I was working for Alan Nye, I bought a camera. Right? So suddenly I didn't take a photograph of him, which I deeply regret, but apparently an artist published put a painting, a portrait of him in the Archibald Prize in 1975, which I'm going to try and hunt down because, it became a finalist. But when Martin came back from England at the end of the 60s, he tracked me down and told me that he was going to open a place called the Yellow House, and it was the idea of the Yellow House, and that's when I met. See, this book was published in 2004, but at the Yellow House at the beginning of the 70s, in 1970 in fact, I met Brett Whiteley and Gary Shedd and George Gittos and Bruce Gould and the other photographer, Johnny Lewis, who I helped kickstart, and Peter Kingston. So suddenly I was in amongst a lot of very creative people, because the idea of the Yellow House was to have an artist community in Sydney. People were just working on things and sharing, their involvement and getting a bit of creative feedback from each other. And so it's that was really the genesis. I'd photographed one artist in 1968, which was the first portrait I'd done of an artist, which is this one of Johnny Bell.
Ah, yes.
And that was in, I think, 1969. And because I'd had this kind of initiation into photography by somebody who focused on beautiful people, beautiful men and women, because his job was to glorify the fashion industry, really. And my involvement with the Yellow House, and particularly once, and because I'd met Johnny Bell, he was my brother's best man at his wedding, I was fascinated by Johnny's complete left of centre appearance. He had a bohemian background. He was sent to art school at the age of 14 because he was dyslexic. Oh. Now, this was just a quirk of the education department, but he could draw very well. And he didn't have great academic skills. And he left the art school at the age of 19 and had a sellout exhibition at Barry Stern Galleries in Paddington. And he was a very early protege of somebody like Donald Friend. He could draw particularly well, and it was around the time that you mentioned where a certain flair and eccentricity was expected of an artist, and he had that. So I asked him whether I could come to his studio, and this is where I did this portrait. Right. And as time went by, I enjoyed that portrait more than any of the fashion photographs that I'd taken over the years. There was something sincere about it. And, that's when I met Brett Whiteley. he became, Brett and I became quite good friends. And it was my camera that actually connected me with all of these different people. Artists needed their work photographed. I could do it. And I needed to connect with them to learn a little bit more about what it was that motivated somebody to get into the world of reinterpreting reality, and that was essentially at the core of their motivation. And I did quite a few portraits of Brett over the years for publicity reasons. He needed to get his work out there. He needed to. He was very much a control individual. He'd write his own press release, get me around to do a portrait of him in a certain situation, and then it would be released to the newspapers, and that would be his publicity for a coming exhibition. And he was very much in control of his own destiny. And he enjoyed also the celebrity status that.
So, Greg, I wanted to, another of the big influences, apart from Martin Sharp, Albert Nye? Alan Nye. And then the introduction of the book. I also wanted to ask you about some of the big influences in your life. I know the Yellow House was one, the meeting with Martin Sharp was another, but then things started to move forward from when you were working with so many high society people and advertising agencies. How did you actually get around to creating images that were more to do with the history of photography and the poetry of photography? Where did that come from?
Well, teaching taught me a fair bit about the history of photography, and I did teach at the National Art School for about 12 years as a part-time photographic tutor. And my research in those years taught me a lot about Alfred Stieglitz and the photo secessionists and the philosophies of people who were significant, like Minor White in America, the photo secessionist movement of the early 20th century, where people like Ansel Adams and Alfred Stieglitz and Minor White elevated the status of a photograph from being a mere record to something that was worthy of being recognised as an art form. Robert Hughes wrote for the New York Times in America, and I happened to read this review that he'd done of an Ansel Adams photograph that sold for 60,000 American dollars at auction, and it was called Moonrise over Hernandez Valley. And Hughes then said, no longer can photography be regarded as a duplication of reality. It's got to be considered as fine art at that price. And it was one of the earliest recognitions that I had experienced, where the status of photography was being brought to the level that I always felt it had deserved to be. And photography was always kind of the second cousin of the painters. It was considered too much of a recreation of reality didn't, the artists would argue that it hadn't gone through the process of the emotional feeling of a painter and been regurgitated as a painting. How could a record of something that we see every day be regarded as an artwork? And of course, the photographers that have stood their ground, and in my case, I see myself as one of those people who saw reality as an illusion, but it was also a mysterious illusion, and that if it could be recreated in a way that shifted it a little bit away from the reality that we perceived into an altered reality, it would actually trigger somebody to sort of think, I know what that is talking about. It's talking about something that I believe that I've never been able to describe. And my interest continued with Central Australia, going to the desert, going into the oldest parts of this continent, and trying to reinterpret a gut feeling for what the landscape could say, and what one could say in order to reinterpret the landscape in a different way. And that's when I did things like these works here, which were, I titled this show that this was involved in, titled Formations. And I found that by interacting with the landscape, and in this case these are senna trees, and they had all folded up during drought, and they resembled folded up umbrellas, and I accentuated that shape by tying up string around them and giving them a different interpretation. And I quite liked interacting with reality in that way, sort of playing with the landscape, and found that once I'd created something like this, and using my camera as the canvas that I was working on, really, because I'd frame a bit of landscape, and from the camera's perspective, work on the landscape until I felt that it had a significant shift in reality, and then do the photograph, and that's how that one was formed. And, I mean, being in the living in the oldest continent in the world, as Brett would say, as a Eurasian, not a European, even though we have European ancestors, we have the privilege of all that we benefit from being European, in terms of interpreting a very remote, ancient part of the land.
And it's more dominant, it's powerful. And I'm sure that, those nocturnes that you did, they must have sort of made you felt very humble in that situation, very, very, very small.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the nocturnes were a very serendipitous encounter, because my partner Carol is a painter, and being a photographer. When we got married in Central Australia, and Martin in fact became our best man, and he came out there, and we spent a bit of time with him after we were married, but took him to Hermannsburg, introduced him to some of the ancestors of Albert Namatjura, and showed him part of the world that he maybe flew over a dozen times on his way to Europe, but he'd never actually touched the ground of the desert. The landscape itself, we're going back has been around there for hundreds of millions of years, and it has a presence, and as we know by the book Songlines, that the landscape has a language and a means of connecting the people that live in it strongly to it. And so I approached it with a great deal of respect, knowing that the first Australians regarded it with stories and song, and as a great source of belonging. They didn't feel an ownership; they felt a connection through birth, I think, and through whilst I say they didn't feel an ownership, I felt that the landscape owned them, and their connection was one of deep respect and understanding, age-old understanding of how both things, their existence and the landscape, were inseparable.
Is that what you were trying to capture in those portraits that you did? Because the portraits of those people that you've taken many of, they seem to reflect a deeper understanding of that rugged countryside. When I look at some of them, is that what you were searching for when you pressed the button?
They sometimes had difficulty understanding why I wanted to photograph them, because physical appearance for the average Aboriginal Australian did not seem to equate to what was really their soul and their presence in the landscape and in life. But once I told them that as a visitor, I was interested in how they looked and how they represented their understanding of the landscape with their art, they allowed me to come closer to them. And as a portrait photographer, I've never wanted to disrespect somebody's physical appearance. I've wanted to maybe get a glimpse into the person behind the physical, maybe using connection with somebody's eyes as being a window to their soul, or a story that they're trying to tell at the time, but not judging so much as being there, to being a witness more than anything. Once people like George Jonerai or Emily Ngawari or Wenton Rabuncha accepted me into their life, they enjoyed the process. And Emily herself was a powerhouse in terms of what she produced in her life. No taller than 5 feet tall, she would sit on the sand, the red bird, and the women would sing songs, and she would chat and work away at a yam dreaming story on a big canvas. And being allowed to be there with her while she was doing that was an incredible privilege, and I would just try to be as discreet as possible. And that's how I got close to them, by encouraging a sense of mutual respect.
Mm-hmm.
Being unable to understand the depth of their existence, it was still acceptable to them to have me there.
I think that's incredible. What you've just said is being unable to understand their kind of background and the way that they've sort of come to the point that they've come to. I think that's very much a part of the relationship that First Nations and non-First Nations people in this country have got to actually sort of broach.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we've just been past. It's just a week or so that Australia Day or Invasion Day has passed its annual experience, and the Europeans and the first explorers came to this country with a very arrogant attitude that negated the existence, terra nullius, the perfect example of an Australian or a Aboriginal or a human occupation of this country. And we were so hell-bent on telling the first Australians what we understood to be true, rather than listening to what they understood to be true. And being a more powerful race of people, or not powerful, that's the wrong term, being the conquering Europeans coming into this country, we had dominance to an extent that while they resisted, they couldn't overcome the power of our dominance, and assimilation was expected. It was expected by the invading British government.
But you do know that the artist's well is coming out of Ireland, and the Irish people had a certain sort of experience of what colonisation is about as well. Yeah. Somebody actually did describe the Irish situation is that they invited the English over for dinner, but they did make the most prolonged stay.
I think we live in probably one of the most multicultural countries in the world here in Australia, which can be good and can have tension as it has at the moment. Anti-Semitic feelings that are happening as a result of Gaza, etc. But I think we're in a position where we've learned a certain amount of racial tolerance, and I think I'm the beneficiary of that because of growing up in a world where I am the visitor.
Yeah. But that also, I mean, getting back to the Indigenous or First Nations connection with the land, there's one last image that I wanted to ask you about, and that is the one which is the sign of the cross. And that was, I mean, I don't know whether you're a particularly religious person, but it was a religious experience for you that came out of that that whole thing. Can you just, we'll finalise with that image. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was the result of I think it was the result of a pilgrimage that I did into the western part of New South Wales. It was purely because I've had somewhere in my deep sense of being in this country a need to want to say something about this country that we live in, visually, say something that's going to enrich the interpretation of this country and what it is and who we are and how we have actually integrated ourselves into this incredible landscape. And I wanted to just follow in the footsteps of certain other great artists that have gone out into the country in Australia, like Russell Drysdale and Sid Nolan and
Arthur Boyd.
Yeah, various artists that have just travelled into the western parts of New South Wales, and I was travelling out in that direction. Look, I went to West Wyalong, which was the source of Russell Drysdale's painting, West Wyalong, which is quite a well-known painting in the Australian cultural landscape, where he did a sketch of this street in West Wyalong, which is about 300 kilometres southwest or west of Sydney, in 1949, and he was waiting for a friend to arrive, and he did this sketch, and his friend arrived, and he already captured the essence of a great iconic portrait of a part of central western New South Wales. So I went to that particular place, stood there and felt a little bit disappointed that so much had changed in, well, it's 55 years. Why wouldn't it? But I'd gone on a bit of a nostalgic pilgrimage to find a little bit of old Australia still happening in this country. For what reason, who knows? I just wanted to find it. And I went then to travel around a little bit further and went to a cattle station, a sheep station, where by pure coincidence the owner of the sheep station had known my father back in the during the war and after the war, and my father worked for a wool company and had bought wool and sold wool from this sheep station to help make army uniforms for the Australian Army to go to battle. So there was a bit of a connection there, and Wally, who ran this sheep station, told me a little bit about shearers and about how the wool had to be dry, and he noticed the rain clouds coming, and he told me that he had to put the sheep into the sheds because he didn't want the wool to get wet. He had the shearers there. They would only shear if the wool was dry. These problems of being a grazier you learn if you visit a wool farm, a sheep farm. And I had to say goodbye to him, and I headed out towards the highway to drive out. I was going out to the west, even further west in New South Wales. And as I drove away from his property about 20 kilometres, I noticed a sign that said a town called Loxley, and I just thought I'd check that town out. And the storm clouds were building up in the rear vision mirror as I drove, and I turned off the side of the main road and into a side road and went to the end of that road, and I was confronted by an incredible scene there where there was a corrugated iron church set against a flat landscape, a flat horizon, which was the Hay Plain, which is one of the flattest plains in New South Wales. The storm clouds were raging in from the east, and this single church was in front of me, corrugated iron, rusty. And I thought, well, my car is exactly where I want to be. I had to drive my car. I had to spin it around and get it away from the scene where I wanted to stand and take a photograph of the approaching apocalyptic storm. And my car left tyre mark in the road, which was like a cross. It just went around and across. And I included that. It completed the picture, really, because I had the storm coming from the east, the old corrugated iron church in the middle, the flat horizon of the plain, the hay plain, the crossover of the tyre tracks, and a glimmer of hope in the west with a little passage of blue sky. And I just took about 5 or 6 photographs before that storm engulfed the scene, and it was all over. And when I got back, I did a print of the shot that I'd taken, and I showed it to my wife Carol, who had a Catholic upbringing, and I said I was searching for a name or a title for this, and she looked at it and she just said Sign of the Cross, which seemed to fit perfectly. There were 5 crucifixes on the little church. There's even a telegraph pole with a cross in it and the cross of the tyre tracks. So I titled it Sign of the Cross, and a few years later entered it into the Blake Prize for Religious Art, where it won the People's Choice Award. So, you know, these things happen. Because you're out there looking, I mean, there was Minor White once when he was asked by a student, what is it that makes a photograph exceptional? And he thought about it for a minute and then said, he used a aperture of f8. He said, f8 and be there, basically. That's what makes it happen. And somebody else once asked me about an exposure and said, what exposure do I use when taking those night skies? And I said, 50 years of f11, you know. So essentially there's no real answer. You just have to be there.
No, that's great. Look, I think that's a really good place to finish. Thank you, Greg. This has been a really wonderful experience and very enlightening. I'm sure that Irish art audiences will get a tremendous insight into what makes an Australian photographer tick.
Great. Okay. Well, pleased to be going to Ireland.
Thank you so much. I believe that was a very poignant end to an amazing interview with an artist who has contributed so much to the sensibility and the understanding of Australian photography and Australian lands and its people. So I'd like to thank Greg Waite and thank you all for watching this. Thank you.